The rain poured hard that night. The city lights blurred through the cafe window like melted colors on canvas. Inside, the warm aroma of roasted coffee and baked bread clung to the air, but the atmosphere was quiet, too quiet for a Friday evening. Julian sat alone at the far corner, disguised in a black hoodie, sipping his black coffee without sugar, without cream, just like his mood. He didn't belong here, not really. His world was made of penthouses, private jets, and business meetings with people who used smiles like weapons. But tonight, something had pushed him out of his glass tower. He didn't know what. Restlessness, maybe. Guilt, perhaps. His father, the legendary Maxwell Brandt, billionaire real estate tycoon, had just announced plans to tear down a dozen city blocks to make room for another luxury complex, one that Julian was expected to oversee. But when Julian had seen the pictures of the families who would be evicted, something inside him cracked. He needed air, real air, not filtered through marble hallways and tinted car windows. So he found himself here, in a little corner cafe downtown that didn't even have a website. That's when she walked in. She was drenched. Her coat was too thin for the storm. Her hair clung to her cheeks. And yet, her smile didn't falter. She carried a small paper bag in one hand and led an older man, blind and shivering, with the other. They sat at the booth directly in Julian's line of sight. She dried her father's face with a napkin, gently, carefully, like he was a child. Then she opened the bag and fed him, piece by piece. Soup from a small thermos. Bread she broke into manageable bites. Every time he whispered thank you, her smile grew brighter. Julian couldn't look away. Something about the way she treated the old man stirred something in him. Something he couldn't name. It wasn't pity. It wasn't admiration. It was something deeper. Something buried. He flagged the waitress. "Who is she?" he asked quietly. The waitress glanced over and whispered, "That's Emily. Comes here every night after her shift. Brings her dad dinner. Lost his sight 5 years ago. She's been taking care of him ever since." Julian leaned back. 5 years? He studied Emily again. Her coat was frayed at the edges. Her boots were worn. But her eyes were fierce, alive, like she carried a universe of stories behind them. When they left, Julian followed, keeping a distance, not really sure why. They didn't live far, just 3 blocks away, in a building so old it seemed to sigh with every gust of wind. The windows were cracked, the paint peeled off in patches. Julian stood across the street, watching Emily unlock the door. Before she stepped inside, she looked up at the sky, closed her eyes, and whispered something. He couldn't hear her, but for some reason he whispered back, "Please don't give up." That night, he couldn't sleep. The next morning, Julian returned to the cafe, sat at the same booth, waited. Hours passed. No sign of her. He came back the next night, and the next. On the 4th night, she walked in, carrying the same bag, wearing the same smile. But something was different. Her walk was slower. Her eyes were puffy, like she hadn't slept. She ordered only a small tea and sat in silence, staring out the window. Her father wasn't with her. Julian couldn't help himself. He walked over. "Is this seat taken?" She looked up, startled. Then shook her head. He sat. They didn't speak for a minute. Then Julian said, "You come here often." Emily chuckled softly. "Is that your best line?" He smiled. "I just noticed you. Feeding your father. It's rare to see someone so devoted." Her smile faded. "He's sick." Julian leaned in. "Is it serious?" She hesitated. "The doctors say it's degenerative. His other senses are deteriorating now too. He forgets things. Gets confused. Sometimes he doesn't even recognize me." Julian wanted to say something comforting, but nothing came out. Emily added, "He was a teacher, you know. English, literature. Used to quote Shakespeare to me when I was little. Now he can't remember what day it is." Julian asked gently, "Do you have help?" She laughed bitterly. "Help? We barely afford his meds. I work double shifts. Sleep maybe 4 hours a night. But I can't complain. He raised me alone. Now it's my turn." Julian stared at her. This woman, this stranger, was everything he wasn't. Strong, selfless, Real. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. Look, I know this is sudden, but I work with a foundation. We help families. Medical support, housing, therapy. No strings attached. Emily looked at the card, then looked at him. Her eyes hardened. Why? Julian hesitated. Because people like you deserve better. She slid the card back. People like me have learned not to trust handouts. She stood up and walked away. Julian sat there, stunned. The next morning, Julian walked into his father's office and said he wanted access to the Brandt Foundation funds. Unrestricted. Maxwell raised an eyebrow. What for? Julian replied, for someone who actually deserves it. Maxwell scoffed. We don't do charity. We do investments. Julian's jaw tightened. Maybe that's the problem. Maxwell waved him off. Go play hero somewhere else. We've got a groundbreaking next week. You're leading it. Julian left without another word. That evening, he returned to Emily's building. He stood outside, holding 2 bags, one with groceries, one with medicine. He rang the bell. No answer. He knocked. Nothing. Then, a voice from a nearby window. She left this morning. Said she was taking her dad somewhere safe. Where? The neighbor shrugged. Didn't say. Just looked tired. Julian searched for days. Called every clinic, every shelter. Nothing. It was like she vanished. 2 weeks passed. Then one morning, a letter arrived at the cafe, addressed to the man in the hoodie. Inside was a note. I don't know who you are, but thank you for trying. I took my father to a hospice. He's resting now. I'm not sure what's next, but I'm not giving up. Please don't either. Emily. Julian read the note 100 times. And then he made a decision. He bought the building where Emily had lived. Quietly. Anonymously. Renovated it completely. Every floor. New plumbing. Heating. Furniture. Even a rooftop garden. And when it was done, he turned it into affordable housing for caretakers and their families. He named it the Whitmore House, his mother's maiden name. The press never heard about it. But every tenant got a letter in the mail. Someone saw your kindness and wanted you to have a safe place to rest. No strings, just respect. 6 months passed. Julian hadn't heard from Emily. Not a word. Until one day, a young boy ran into the building's lobby with a red envelope. He handed it to the front desk lady and said, "Give this to the man who fixed this place." Inside the envelope was a photo. Emily, standing in front of a bookstore, smiling, holding a sign, "Grand Opening," and a handwritten note. You were right. People like me do deserve better. So I built better. For myself. For Dad. He passed peacefully last month. But not before I told him about you. Thank you. If you ever need a story to read, come visit. The tea's on me. Emily. Julian held the photo for a long time. Then he turned to his driver. Take me there. As the car rolled through the city, Julian looked out at the people on the sidewalks, the ones everyone else ignored. He realized something. The world didn't need another billionaire. It needed more people like Emily. When the car stopped, he stepped out. The bookstore was small, cozy, painted sky blue. There was a bench out front with flowers growing beside it. Through the window, he saw Emily laughing with a customer. Her hair was tied up. Her eyes were glowing. She hadn't seen him yet. He didn't walk in. Not yet. He stood there for a moment longer, watching her. Then he smiled and reached into his coat. He pulled out a small black box. Inside was a key to a second building. This one even bigger, and not far from here. He'd bought it last week. He didn't know why, but now he did. And what he planned to do next would change everything. Julian stepped back from the window as a gust of wind scattered cherry blossom petals across the sidewalk. He still held the black box with the key inside. Its weight somehow heavier now, though it was just metal and velvet. The key wasn't just to a building, it was to a decision. One he hadn't completely made until now. He looked at the small sign on the bookstore door again. Open hearts, open books. Below it, in smaller script, stories can change lives. So can kindness. He turned, walked to the bench, and sat. His chest felt strange, tight, like it was struggling to contain something. Gratitude, maybe. Or regret. He wasn't sure which was stronger. Emily hadn't seen him yet. She moved from shelf to shelf, arranging books with a natural grace, laughing with an older couple. She didn't look tired anymore. That fierce fire he had seen in her the first night in the cafe was still there, but now it was calmer, warmer, purposeful. She was exactly where she was meant to be. He could have walked in, told her everything. But something stopped him. He wasn't ready. Not because he feared rejection, though if he was honest, maybe that too, but because he hadn't finished what he started. Helping Emily had opened a wound in him, one that had never fully healed. All his life, he'd been taught to climb ladders, build empires, crush obstacles. But no one had ever taught him how to feel, how to see people. Not really. Emily had done that. Without knowing it, without asking for anything. She had turned his world upside down just by being human. And he owed it to her, and himself, to finish the change she had started. He stood up, slid the key back into his coat pocket, and walked away. Over the next 2 weeks, Julian disappeared from the social circuits completely. No parties. No business meetings. His father called 5 times. He didn't answer once. The 6th time his father left a message, "Don't forget where you come from." Julian stared at the voicemail for a long time, then deleted it. He threw himself into the new building project with a kind of ferocity he didn't know he had. But this wasn't a tower of luxury. It wasn't going to be another Brandt monolith with gold trim and rooftop pools. No, this building had a purpose. It would be a literacy and learning center, with a free clinic on the bottom floor, a library in the middle, and apartments for single parents and caregivers on the top levels. The kind of place where people like Emily could breathe, grow, and dream again. He met with architects, urban planners, local teachers, and therapists. He hired social workers instead of PR teams. The building didn't even carry his name. It would be called the Story House. Simple, direct, quiet, like the people it was meant to serve. But the city wasn't quiet about it. Rumors swirled. Reporters sniffed around. Blogs started asking questions. Why would the son of a billionaire pour millions into a free community project with no brand? Julian ignored it all. And then one day, while reviewing blueprints with a construction foreman on site, he turned and saw her. Emily. She stood on the other side of the temporary fencing, holding a book in one hand, the wind tugging her coat. Their eyes met. Her expression didn't change. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just watched him. And Julian's heart raced. She had found him. Or maybe he had been waiting for her. He walked over slowly. She spoke first. "You disappeared." He nodded. "I had work to do." She looked past him at the construction site. "Someone told me about this place. That it was built in memory of a blind man who loved poetry." Julian smiled gently. "Your father." She didn't answer, just looked at him harder, like she was trying to read him like one of her books. Finally, she asked, "Why do all of this? Why not just hand over a check and move on with your life?" Julian hesitated, then said, "Because I didn't want to just fix a moment. I wanted to fix myself." That caught her off guard. He continued, "You showed me something I didn't know I needed. You showed me what it means to care. Not with money, with time, with effort, with presence. And I realized I've spent most of my life surrounded by people who wear masks. You never wore one, not even when life gave you every reason to." Emily looked away for a second, then back. Her voice softened. "You think building this changes who you are?" "No," Julian said. "I think it reveals who I could be." Silence stretched between them. Then she stepped forward, holding out the book. "It's yours," she said. "You left something unfinished." He took the book. It was worn, pages creased, cover slightly torn. It was a collection of short stories. On the first page, written in delicate handwriting, were the words, "To the man who chose kindness over comfort, keep writing your story." She turned and walked away. Julian stood frozen for a long time. Later that night, he returned to the bookstore. This time he walked in. The bell above the door chimed, soft and welcoming. The shelves were filled with stories from around the world, Some classics, some new, some written by local authors. A little girl sat in the corner reading aloud to her mother. The air smelled like cedar and cinnamon. Emily was behind the counter sorting receipts. She looked up, surprised but not startled. Julian held up the book. I read the first story. It was about a man who loses his sight but sees the world more clearly than ever before. She nodded. That one was inspired by my dad. Julian smiled. I figured. He stepped closer. I have a proposition. Her eyes narrowed suspiciously. If it involves money. It doesn't, he cut in. It involves stories. Yours. Others. I want to use the new building for more than housing. I want to create a space where people like your father, teachers, poets, dreamers, can share what they've seen. Even if they're gone. Even if they were never seen themselves. She was silent. Then she said, "That's a beautiful idea." "It's your idea, Emily," he said softly. "You just never had the platform." For the first time, her eyes shimmered. They spent the next few hours sketching plans on napkins. A quarterly journal. A weekly story night. A scholarship named after her father. A mural wall for every resident to paint a chapter of their life. They laughed. They argued. They dreamed. When Julian left that night, the bookstore lights still glowing behind him, he knew something had changed. Not just in him, in them. They had started something neither of them fully understood yet. But it felt right. The weeks that followed moved fast. The story house neared completion. Volunteers flooded in. Emily became its heart, organizing readings, designing the mural wall, helping single moms apply for residencies. Julian handled the logistics, but always made time to walk the halls in the evenings, listening to the echoes of laughter, hope, and healing. One night, just as the final inspection passed and the ribbon-cutting ceremony was scheduled, Julian got a call from his father. "I heard what you've been doing." Julian said nothing. Maxwell's voice was clipped. "I'm not angry, just disappointed." Julian laughed bitterly. "Because I didn't build another luxury complex?" "No," Maxwell said. "Because you wasted your chance to dominate. You had the power. You chose sentiment." Julian exhaled. "Maybe that's the difference between us. You built towers. I want to build bridges." Maxwell didn't respond. The line went dead. Julian looked out the window at the story house glowing softly in the night. Let him be disappointed. He had finally become proud of himself. The opening ceremony was small, intentionally. No press. Just residents, neighbors, artists, and a choir from a nearby school. Emily stood beside him as the ribbon fell. They didn't make speeches. Instead, they handed the microphone to a 12-year-old girl who had written a poem about her mother working 3 jobs. There wasn't a dry eye in the courtyard. That night, as the party died down and people filtered out, Julian and Emily sat together under the stars, leaning against the newly painted mural wall. She turned to him. "So what's next?" Julian thought for a moment. Then he looked at her and said, "Whatever story we want to write." And she smiled. Because for the first time in a long time, she believed him. The days that followed the grand opening of the story house were filled with something Julian had rarely experienced before. Silence that felt peaceful. Not empty, not lonely, just still. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm, when the air is clean, and you can finally hear your own heartbeat again. He spent most mornings walking the halls before anyone arrived, touching the handrails, brushing his fingers across the painted murals, each stroke a story. Some drawings were simple, a cup of coffee, a child's smile, a bus ticket to somewhere new. Others were deep, a cracked pair of glasses next to a violin, a prison door fading into the sky. These weren't just decorations. They were memories. Pieces of people who had finally found a place where they mattered. Emily had become more than the heart of the project. She had become the spirit of a place. Everyone called her by name. Kids hugged her waist without asking. Adults listened to her when she spoke, not just out of politeness, but reverence. She hadn't just survived her past. She had turned it into purpose. Julian admired her from a distance most days, not because he was unsure of how he felt, but because he didn't want to rush something so rare. Their bond had grown like roots underground, quietly, steadily. What they had wasn't built in a flash of passion. It was being carved slowly, with care, like stone under patient hands. But Julian knew, eventually, there would come a choice. One night, after helping restock the book section for a midnight reading, Julian sat across from Emily in the quiet cafe corner of the building. The place was empty except for them. She had a mug of cinnamon tea. He had his usual black coffee, but barely touched it. She leaned back, eyes tired but warm. "You've been quiet lately." "I've been thinking," he replied. "That sounds dangerous." He chuckled, but it faded quickly. "My father offered me a deal. One last time." She said nothing, waiting. "He wants me to come back. Take over the empire fully. Merge my projects under his. It's everything I once wanted. And now, I don't know who I am there anymore." Emily studied him for a moment, then said, "You don't owe anyone your soul, Julian. Not even your father." He stared at her, heart swelling. "You're the first person who ever said that to me." She tilted her head. "Then you've been surrounded by the wrong people for a very long time." He smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "If I stay here, I lose the inheritance. The board will vote me out. I become ordinary." She leaned in, voice steady. "You become free." Julian looked at her, and for the first time since they met, he realized what he'd really been chasing. Not redemption, not purpose, but connection. A real one. Not a transaction. Not a partnership. A bond. One built not on wealth or appearances, but on shared values. Pain. Hope. Truth. He reached across the table and took her hand. "I want to build a life. Not just buildings." Her fingers tightened around his. "Then start with this moment." And that was it. That night, Julian made his choice. The following week, headlines across the business world exploded with confusion and speculation. Julian Brandt walks away from billions. Heir to empire chooses bookstore over boardroom. From skyscrapers to story houses. Why one billionaire's son gave it all up. Julian ignored every interview request. He didn't want to talk. He wanted to do. And so he began the work of simplifying. Selling his penthouse, donating the art collection, transferring unused land to community programs. The more he let go, the lighter he felt. For the first time, money didn't control him. He controlled it. And most of it he gave away quietly, anonymously. Not because he wanted to vanish, but because the power wasn't in being seen. It was in seeing others. Meanwhile, the story house bloomed. A young mother who had never finished high school completed her GED and got hired as the community librarian. A former gang member started teaching self-defense classes for at-risk teens. A blind man who had been living in his car began hosting poetry readings on Thursdays. His voice slow and deliberate, each word like a small miracle. One afternoon, as Julian was repainting the side gate with some local kids, a silver car pulled up. He turned, and his face went still. His father stepped out. Maxwell Brandt looked smaller than Julian remembered. Not in stature, but in spirit. He walked with the stiffness of pride, trying not to bend. "Nice gate," Maxwell said dryly. Julian wiped paint from his hands. "What are you doing here?" Maxwell looked around. Children laughing. Music in the distance. A mural of a giant open book stretching across a concrete wall. "I had to see it," he said. "See what could possibly be worth throwing everything away for." Julian shrugged. "Now you've seen it." Maxwell stared at him. "You could have had it all, son." "I do," Julian replied. They stood in silence. Then Maxwell said, not bitterly, but almost like a question, "You think this matters?" Julian pointed at a boy tying a volunteer badge to his shirt. "To him? More than you'll ever understand." Maxwell sighed. For a moment, Julian saw something flicker behind his father's eyes. Regret, maybe. Or recognition. But it passed. He got back in the car and drove away. Julian didn't watch him go. He returned to the kids, who had started painting the words "Hope Lives Here" under the gate's arch. Life settled into a rhythm. Julian and Emily moved into a modest apartment above the bookstore. They hosted Sunday dinners with residents. She wrote late into the night. He worked early in the mornings. Sometimes they argued, mostly about silly things like shelf space or coffee preferences. But they always came back to each other, steady and unshaken. Seasons passed. One winter morning, Julian found an envelope tucked under the bookstore door. No return address. Inside was a photo. It was of Emily years ago, sitting beside her father in the cafe, feeding him soup, her eyes focused on him with such care it almost hurt to look at. On the back, someone had written, "Kindness echoes louder than money ever will." No signature. Julian slipped the photo into a frame and placed it on the checkout counter. They never found out who sent it. Years went by. The Story House expanded into other neighborhoods. Not through chains or franchises, but through mentorships, partnerships, whispers of hope passed from one city to the next. Every location had a mural. Every wall told stories. Every child who walked in felt seen. Emily became a published author. Her first book, Feeding Light, was a collection of essays and poems about caregiving, survival, and finding meaning in small, everyday acts of love. It was dedicated simply, "For my father, and for the man who finally saw me." Julian never asked for more than that. One spring evening, under the golden light of setting sun, they sat on the rooftop garden they'd built together. Flowers bloomed around them. Children's voices echoed from below. Emily rested her head on Julian's shoulder. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly. "The suits? The skyscrapers? The boardrooms?" "Yeah." Julian was quiet, then said, "No. I used to think power was about control. Now I know it's about service. And peace doesn't live in glass towers." She smiled. A long pause. Then Emily whispered, "Thank you for seeing me that day." Julian kissed the top of her head. "You were never invisible. I just had to open my eyes." They sat like that as stars appeared one by one. Time moved on, as it always does. But the Story House stood. And every now and then, a stranger would walk in looking lost, empty, or broken. And someone, maybe Emily, maybe Julian, maybe a child who once was the same, would smile and say, "Come in. Tell us your story." Or just listen. Because they understood now. A single act of kindness can echo through generations. And the richest people aren't always the ones in mansions. Sometimes they're the ones with ink-stained hands, tired eyes, and hearts full of light.